Okay, good morning. Welcome to the second session on COVID-19 and well-being. We have 4 papers scheduled for the second session. So we will start with the paper by Jessica and Mo on well-being, recovery and resilience in a crisis. Insights into life satisfaction trends from Europe's last recession for the COVID-19 era. Then we have a paper by Stephanie, Rossouw, Talita, Greyling, and Tamanna, Adhikari on happiness lost. And then in the second part, we have contributions by Annie Tubadji and colleagues and Samuel Tomczyk. I will make now the first presenters panelists, and then we can start with the presentations.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Perfect. I think I made the wrong one panelist, so your colleague
yes,
more
that was
I need. Yeah. Hold on. I can't see more. It's appearing as panelists.
I can see. I think he just popped up.
Yes. Okay. Perfect.
And we'll be presenting together, but he'll actually be the one sharing his screen. So.
Okay. So that is perfect. I will now ask you to share your screen, and then you can. And then the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Okay, it's working? Yeah, should be.
Yep, it looks good. All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for having us. We're excited to be here, and thanks so much for all the organizational work. So my name is Jessica Mahoney, and I am presenting today with my colleague, Moritz Hengel, and we're both with the OECD Statistics and Data, so doing work on well-being. So today, we'll be talking about risk and crisis exposure, really, and trying to use data from the great financial crisis of 2007 and 2008 to try and say something about lessons for resilience for the current pandemic. So here is just a brief overview of what we'll be talking about today. All right, so bigger picture motivation for our approaching this project. The first question is just trying to understand better why countries experience crises differently, especially in terms of their subjective well-being outcomes. So some countries in the face of an economic or financial crisis will see a sharp drop in subjective well-being outcomes followed by a quick recovery. Others see a sharp drop that's sustained over a long period of time. Other countries don't really seem to be affected. So what is driving these differences? What is driving the differences in resilience? And it's our hope that in better understanding the heterogeneous experiences from previous financial crises and economic crises, we'll be able to learn something about resilience for the current pandemic. And as I said, we're both with the OECD, so for our directorate, there's also a very practical application for this, wanting to be able to communicate to policymakers in different OECD countries. Here's what has worked best in the past in terms of policies for promoting resilience. Part of our motivation as well is trying to understand whether the changes in life satisfaction during a crisis can be explained primarily by one single dimension. So we would think that would be something like unemployment, labor market risk, something to do with that. Or whether they're part of more of a multidimensional framework. And the image that we have shown here is the OECD's well-being framework, in which well-being is conceived across 11 different key dimensions for current well-being, and then also 4 dimensions for the determinants of future well-being, which is how they classify things like human capital, social capital, etc. And so we use this as a guide when we're conceptualizing what well-being, broadly speaking, means. So at its core, I think our research question is, what can we learn about well-being from the great financial crisis, and what lessons can we then apply to current day? But more specifically, we're looking at, so I would say, 3 key questions. So the first question is better understanding of what does crisis exposure mean? What does it mean for someone to be exposed to a crisis? And we look at this across different dimensions of well-being, so financial, economic, health. Second question is, can we create an accurate risk profile at an individual level, and then for different countries? So what we're trying to do here is say who is most at risk for being exposed to a crisis? And then third, can we use these risk profiles to then map well-being recovery in the medium and long run and try and discern some lessons from that? So the goal then would be to use microdata, so individual level data, to better understand well-being crisis and recovery from the financial crisis, and then recovery in the long run across a wide set of countries. So in order to answer that question as rigorously and as well as we'd want, the ideal data source that we would need would be a balanced long-term panel. You would want to have diverse measures of well-being that would cover, the entirety of the framework to really be able to identify the different impacts. And then ideally, you'd want to have comparable questions, questionnaires across a large geographic area, so you could really do this in depth for all sorts of countries. So clearly, the challenge for this is that such an ideal data source doesn't exist. There are some data sources that potentially come close, but it's very difficult to get access. However, increasingly over the past decade, a number of OECD countries have begun to collect subjective well-being data. So in some cases, this is a part of a long-term panel, but in many cases, it's part of repeated cross-sectional studies. So there is a lot of data out there now that's subjective well-being data that could be used to answer this question, though it's not part of a panel. And so in conceiving of this project, we've now revised the goal. And so what we're attempting to do now, just see on the next slide. So the revised goal is to craft a message that can, craft a method that can link subjective well-being outcomes across survey waves in repeated cross-sections when you don't have panel data available. So our approach then, so here's what we plan to do, and we'll spend the next section talking about this in greater detail. So the first step is to draw a multi-dimensional picture of a crisis. For this, we're using Multi-Correspondence Analysis, MCA, and I'll let Mo talk about this more in the next section. But essentially what we're trying to do here is see how well different dimensions of a crisis coincide with one another. Do they co-move? And things we're looking at here include sort of labor market outcomes like job loss, but also other conceptions of well-being like mental health deterioration, loss of trust, etc. Then the second step, we'll identify who's at risk. So for this, we're using fixed characteristics of an individual, like their gender, education, and then very broad measures of socioeconomic background. And using this, we assign them a risk value to determine how likely they are to suffer from a crisis. And then the final step is looking at long-run recovery. So here what we're trying to do is see how much of the difference in life satisfaction in the long term was because of crisis recovery specifically. So for the purposes of today, what we'll be showing you, we're using 2 country-specific panel data sets. So the German Socioeconomic Panel and the British Understanding Society Survey. So an important thing to note, yes, these are long-term panel data where you can follow individuals over time. So this is not a repeated cross-section. Our goal, though, in using this is to sort of prove that our method works, proof of concept, I guess you could say. So we can test it then against actual panel data to then hopefully extend to these types of repeated cross-sectional data sets. So that's a brief overview, and at this point, will turn it over to Mo, who will talk more through the next section.
Thank you. So now we basically just look at the time frame of the Great Financial Crisis and try to understand what the dimensionality of the crisis was and who was most at risk. As Jessica said, the data that we use mostly for this section is the German Socioeconomic Panel and the British Household Panel Survey, and not the ideal, which is not covering as many countries as we would like to, but this is more to see if what we do works. Both panels are annual household panels running for a long time, covering quite a broad range of different measures for the well-being dimensions that we've seen earlier. So, the different dimensions that the OECD conceptualizes as well-being. Unfortunately, the British Household Panel, when it was transitioned to the Understanding Society in 2009, didn't resample in 2009 the same respondents, only in 2010. So the panel has a gap in 2009, which is very unfortunate because when the crisis is harder. So for the purpose of today, we'll focus on the German socioeconomic panel and present the UK results as well, but it should be taken with a pinch of salt. The method that we apply here is a multiple correspondence analysis. Those of you who know a PCA, principal component analysis, this is basically the same thing applied to categorical responses, because usually people in interviews tend to answer in categories rather than continuous variables. And the measures that we use more precisely are, for Germany, loss of employment, loss of income, job security, trust, difficulties to make ends meet, deteriorating health, lower satisfaction with housing and finances, a broad range of different measures that we have to conceptualize that people are experiencing a crisis more severely. The UK has similar measures, somewhat not as many, unfortunately, but a very good measure of a better measure of mental health, for example, which is nice. It's important to note that, as Jessica pointed out, that we exploit the panel structure of data that we have here. So we look at changes and not in numbers, which probably makes a lot of sense if you. So it's not like crisis defined as people are being bad off, but people being worse off than before. So if you now look, this is already the first picture that you get from the MCA. The first thing to focus on is that the first dimension captures 92% of the inertia. Inertia being the equivalent of a variance. That is to say, most of the action that is happening in all these variables that we listed here is happening along the first dimension. Now, the second thing to note is that with a point cloud of zeros around here, which is showing the people for whom nothing is happening. So crisis doesn't really have an effect. There's no movement and they're all quite close together, which makes sense. Now, for the ease of interpretation, we've coded changes along these well-being dimensions here. It's binary, so this picture is easier to read. Otherwise, it gets very messy, but it changes the same if you include all the different categories that you can answer. So for example, that would be losing a job or losing more than 5% of your income, or becoming less on a 0 to 10 scale, 2 points or more less satisfied with a satisfaction variable that we measure. So this is just a binary, the binary measures. And now if we try to interpret this dimension, the first dimension, and see what it is actually, if you look at the dark blue, dark blue 0 here, which is indicating no change in employment, and the -1 here, which indicates that you lose your employment, these are actually perfectly aligned horizontally. So this first dimension can be seen as something that is happening exactly along the employment dimension. And of course, income co-moves. If you project those all to down on the axis here, these are those also co-move. And interesting, for example, the health measure that we have here also co-moves with that, apparently. So there seems to be one rather comprehensive dimension, a measure of crisis that we have, which is centered around becoming unemployed for the ease of interpretation. Now, important question, what is the second most important dimension that the dimensionality reduction gives us? In our view, this is basically capturing something about the way satisfaction variables are answered. So if you look, this is basically distinguishing just this line of points from those guys here. And these are satisfaction with jobs, satisfaction with housing, satisfaction with finances, which measure similar things, for example, than loss in income or job security, for example. So we do believe that this is mostly. Second dimension seems to be something that just capturing a measurement artifact. Now, the same picture for the UK, unfortunately, looks a bit messier. But still, we see that most of the action is captured by the first dimension. In total, the first two dimensions capture much less than for Germany, which might be due to the fact that we're missing an important crisis year. But still, actually, if you look at this the first dimension, which seems to be quite important, and you draw a diagonal here, for example, between unemployment and mental health, for example, also seem to move here, which tends to suggest that the crisis in the UK was also centered around employment issues. Again, the second dimension seems to single out the variables that we measure on satisfaction scale. So there's something So again, we believe this is a measurement artifact capturing something about the way satisfaction variables are measured. Now, so to sum up, when we apply the MCA, the first dimension of the MCA captures most of the action for Germany and also quite a bit of the UK, and it seems to be centered around labor market variables. And the second dimension seems to be not so important. So if we want to assign a dimensionality of the last crisis in terms of well-being, it seems to be centered around employment. Now, is this MCA a good measure? If we extract the first dimension and we the value of each observation along this dimension, depending on how they answer, and regress it on life satisfaction, actually. So for Germany, as I said, for the UK, it's not as interesting because the crisis here is losing. But for Germany, for example, the R squared is doubles from 3 to 7% in the years where the crisis action is actually taking place. And it explains quite well, thus explains quite well the changes in life satisfaction. So it does make some sense. So now we turn to the question. We try to explain who was most at risk, who were those people that were most exposed to the crisis. This is extracting the first dimension of the MCA for Germany, and then plotting the density of how many people had what value of risk to be exposed to the crisis. Again, this is like the cloud points of zeros that we've seen before. People for whom nothing is happening, like they're not affected, or rather they don't experience a change. And then this is the start here. Most people are somewhat affected from those that are affected. Then we have a very long right tail. Some people are very heavily affected, but only very few. Now, next step is that we try to explain, rather to see who was most at risk. So which fixed characteristics that people have made them more exposed to the crisis in Germany. It's just regressing this risk MCA on fixed characteristics. And then what we see is that men were more at risk. We think that is probably because men were more active in the labor market to begin with, and thus more likely to lose their job. But in education, for example, seems like a good protection against the crisis, and also the most important, the largest magnitude actually we find for people belonging to a ethnic minority in Germany, which is rather indirectly measured as having a migration background. Unfortunately, there's no better measure. And then if you turn to where people were employed or which sector of employment people are in, then it's if you work in manufacturing, for example, that seems like a good idea, of banking and insurances. Whereas if you work in an unclassified or let's say service sector, for example, you seem to have been more at risk. Same picture for the UK. I have to say that the magnitudes here are somewhat odd, so that the overall picture stays the same. Ethnicity and coming from a minority actually seems like a very strong predictor of having been exposed. And again, education seems to help a little bit. And blue collar workers here in semi-routine and routine jobs were also more exposed to the crisis according to this measure. Now, the final step that we do is having characterized the crisis in its in terms of well-being, and then understood who is most at risk. We follow those people over time. So we follow that's a very rough measure, but we just impute how, given your fixed characteristics, how strongly would you have been, how likely is it that you have been exposed to the crisis? And then we regress each year life satisfaction on this imputed value. And then what we get for this picture for Germany again is actually that we, having been exposed to the crisis, or rather having been at risk during the crisis, is associated with a strongly, so this is on a 0 to 10 scale. Those of you who know the SOEP, there's like a 2-point gap between those people that were more at risk versus those that were less at risk. But then they recover quite quickly, and by 2012, that is, there's actually no significant difference anymore. It's important to stress here that this is only for Germany. And Germany, if we do focus on unemployment, most of the action was happening, I think, in these years here up to 2010. And by 2011-12, I believe the unemployment went back to pre-crisis levels, and so it wasn't quite so severe. It would be very interesting to apply this to different countries and see whether we find similar movements, or rather if the crisis lingered longer, for example. Anyways, the message here, which also leads to the next section, is that there seems to have been some medium-term impacts of the last crisis, and it might take some time for people to recover, especially from unemployment.
So to wrap up, we sort of briefly have some preliminary, I guess, recommendations or lessons learned from what we've done thus far. Go to the next slide. Perfect. So just to sort of, again, very briefly sum up everything that Mo presented, lessons from the previous crises. So one, it seems that changes to life satisfaction primarily center around this question of unemployment, financial security, financial insecurity rather, and we see this both in Germany and the UK. Two, other drivers of life satisfaction seem to co-move with unemployment. So there's no mental health data for the German panel data, but in the UK, it seems that mental health seems to be linked to job security and co-move. And then point three, those most at risk appear to be those who are poor, less well educated, those in the service industry. So if we look at similarities to the current pandemic and the current situation, of course, unemployment remains an issue. And there are some similarities in terms of those who are at risk. So preliminary studies that have been published already about the COVID-19 crisis show that minorities, those with less education and younger age cohorts are all more likely to become unemployed or to experience labor market risk factors. In terms of differences, looking at unemployment specifically, this crisis, there's actually quite a lot of evidence thus far that women seem to be more likely than men to lose their jobs, which appears to be a difference from previous crises. Another point to make is that thus far in the short term in Europe, so with those caveats, unemployment hasn't risen as sharply as feared. And this may change in the longer term fallout from the current pandemic, but in the short term, it does appear to be having a different type of effect. And then importantly, declines in mental health in this pandemic are unlikely to co-move with only unemployment, as was the case as suggested evidence appears to have been the case last time. Other factors include health, of course, not just actually contracting COVID, but also anxiety about passing on the virus and things like this. Also less time spent socializing, less social connection because of social distancing and confinement. And then another unique facet of this crisis is the effects that it's having on mental health of parents with school-aged children. The stress of balancing childcare and full-time employment while based at home is something that appears to be quite unique. So in sum, very generally, this crisis does appear to be much more multidimensional in terms of its effects on life satisfaction. So with that, that's sort of the bulk of our presentation. We welcome many of your questions and feedback. We have a few points here of, guiding your questions, but of course, open it up to you for any questions you may have.
Many thanks for your presentation. Are there any questions? I already see hands raised, so you can also post your questions in the chat box, I have to say, so then I will read it out loud, and or in the Q&A box. So I will start with Kelsey.
Yes, hello. Very interesting. And just to respond to some of your immediate questions, there's the other panel data surveys that in some cases have been integrated. There's the Center for, I'm forgetting what it's called right now, CNEF, but it includes the panel study for income dynamics in the US, the Korean CLIPS study, the Australian HILDA study. And so there's one way you may be able to integrate all of them. And what I'm thinking about the MCA is the period in which you fit it. The relationships for these variables may be very different in the crisis years or the, say, normal years. So it would be very interesting. Right now you have an implicit assumption that the variables say the impact on your outcome, life satisfaction, being is the same. And that may or may not be the case. So you have additional time period here in which you can analyze the questions before the crisis, the financial crisis 2008, and then you also have the period in between. I'm interested to know, I guess, if I am correct in saying that the MTA was fitted just in the years 2008, 2010, 12, and if you plan on, say, ending period to include a period of analysis to include more years.
Sorry, I couldn't hear all of the question, but I think I got the most important bits. So please follow up if I'm missing something. Yeah, you're correct. So it was the NCA is completed on 2008 to 2011, I think. Simply, yeah. So that was the time frame. But that's actually like an important issue. When do you? What do you? What time is? What year actually?
Yes, okay, that's a helpful answer. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, so I'm just going to mute.
Me too.
What I'm stating. So, but helpful, yes. And in general, I just want to see what you guys end up doing with this. Is very interesting for me. So, thank you.
Okay, many thanks. We go to Daniela. Hope the microphone works this time.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Can you hear me this time?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Very relevant work done and very well presentation. Thank you. I would like to formulate a question what actually I asked in a previous session, and it's mostly about the background, the social demographic characteristic of the population. And in the context of this study, I'm interested if you take in account dimension related to foreign born and yes, their reaction into crisis setting. Thank you.
Mo, maybe I'll let you answer, but the short answer is yes, certainly for Germany. And I don't actually remember if the UK, the data is just if you belong to an ethnic or racial minority. I don't know if it says anything about migration status, but.
There is a possibility to include in Germany whether you were born in Germany or not. Obviously, that's captured by having a direct migration background and having an indirect migration background. Your parents weren't born in Germany, so this is like a better measure to use. It's a bit confusing, I have to admit, the way it's collected. This is measured in Germany, and then for the UK, this is actually a somewhat measure. It's also much more detailed. But the main story here is that actually being from a minority, even conditional on your education and where you work, it does matter quite a bit, which actually is much, the magnitudes, as I said, should be interpreted with caution, but all for Germany and the UK, this seems to be a very important factor indeed.
And if am I allowed to develop a little bit in the setting of other question what I ask? It is about this concern now with the groups at risk. And my question formulated to you is if it will be possible to integrate a little bit more about the demand for healthcare in cases of risk in order to do more predictions. I'm not sure if you got my question, but it is related to the previous crisis and how people health status and the demand for healthcare are collaborating and affecting a model.
So I think in this case, it would be very interesting is to look at the exact policy setting. For example, we know that for Greece, which experienced the crisis very differently, obviously, the demand for healthcare was rising, but at the same time, people had difficulties to pay for healthcare services, which was not exactly the case in Germany, for example. So I think it's a very important dimension, especially that is something that we're looking into to better understand the current crisis, evidently. But for just the exercise that we've done here, unfortunately, we don't have the data for healthcare demand. The only thing that we have is whether people subjectively say their own mental health for the UK, or for Germany, the general health has become worse.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
But I agree with what I mentioned.
Okay, I am done. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. I think then we have a final question. Looking at the hands, now more hands raised. A final question from Kundi Knies in the chat box who asks, who says, I'm a bit confused about the samples you're using. Why are there more than 293 or 39,000 observations in the journal panel and only 24K observations in the UK data?
That's an excellent question. So the German data is just very broad. But I do have to admit that now looking at it, the sample size, I think that's no, I think that's fine and covering these years. But the UK data, the problem is evidently that maybe that's a good opportunity to talk about a different sample selection issue. Is that it is quite demanding to have people answer all of these questions. And the missing values are a big problem, especially if we think about who is missing here. That's something that we hinted at here. That this is maybe the one reason why we mention is that we don't have measures of the other dimension, and these surveys mostly focus on unemployment. We do have other well-being measures, but still, it might be the case that because we have good employment measures and not so good measures in other variables. And yeah, some sample selection issues come with that.
Okay. Many thanks for your response and many thanks for your presentation. And I think it's time to move to the next presenters.
Yes, a final comment. If anyone wants to shoot us an email with additional feedback, we would welcome that very much. So just first name and last name at oecd.org would work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, then we move to the next presentation, which will be by Stephanie Rossouw, Talita Greyling, and Tamanna Adhikari. And I will move you to the panelist section.
Hi.
Hi, Stephanie.
Hi. Are you still awake?
I hope I have Talita as well now.
Yeah, she's there.
Is your first, your co-author, the last one, coming? Or?
Tamanna. Yeah,
Yes.
she's already in the session. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I will make her panelist as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Martijn.
Perfect. So the floor is yours.
Martijn, I will be presenting.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's share my screen.
Yeah. You can. Yeah, we can see your screen.
Can you and all right, we've got it. I say this presentation also used the Gross National Happiness Index, on which we have been working, which mainly uses big data. The paper is specifically for South Africa, and we look at the effect of lockdown on happiness. So just to give you some background, all right, with the lockdown, many governments opted to lockdown to curb the spread of COVID-19. But there's a big debate about that. It's basically to lockdown or not to lockdown. And obviously, if you lock down, you can curb the spread of COVID. And in South Africa, it also gave us some time to prepare our health systems. But on the other hand, the lockdown definitely might have a lot of well-being costs, including happiness, a big part of it on the economic side. Now, the main thing here is to look at the effect of lockdown in a very extreme case. So South Africa, in this case, we we define as an extreme country, and we will tell you why just now. So we look at a happiness loss. And secondly, we look at what determines happiness during a lockdown. So those are our main research questions. If you look at previous literature, and the literature is just rolling in, so it's difficult to keep up, but something very similar to what we've done is the paper by Prodeur, and using Google Trends also to investigate what is the effect of lockdown on life satisfaction. They also used various other factors or other dependent variables. Then there are 2 other papers done by ourselves, me and my co-authors and I, which you will hear over the next few days. But the main contribution in this paper is that we're specifically looking at the extreme country scenario. So a country where, I will explain exactly what we say with extreme country. And then we are looking, the other contribution is, did the determinants basically of happiness during a lockdown change? And does it look different to before lockdowns? What came into play? And then obviously this is one of the very few studies that are using real-time data as variables, as independent and dependent variables in the analyses. So just some background on South Africa, why we call it an extreme case. Number one, our happiness levels are really low compared to other countries. So happiness levels to start off is quite low. We've got extremely high unemployment rates. So before the lockdown, that's BL, is the unemployment rate, and this is narrow definition, was 29%. At the moment, it's estimated at around about 50% of people are unemployed. Our growth rate has dropped to about 4%, estimated to decrease by 7% by the end of the year. We have been downgraded to junk status. Consumption has declined significantly. Our debt to GDP ratio is 80% at this stage, and we have the highest inequality levels in the world. And then on the other hand, if we look at our lockdown or the strictness of our lockdown, we have some of the strictest lockdown regulations that has been implemented in the world. So on level 5 lockdown, we were only allowed to leave our homes for essential goods. We had to work from home. We were not allowed to travel. Then specifically, there was a ban on alcohol and tobacco products because they said it contributed to COVID. People were not allowed to exercise outside their homes, but they were not allowed to move out of their homes at all. This was very severely policed by the police force and the defense force. We did move out of level 5 on 1 May, and there was some relaxation on this, but not much. At this stage, then we moved into level 3, and at the time of the paper, we're still level 3 with curfews and very limited movement. So 2 scenarios, on the well-being side, happiness low, economy is really looking bad, and with very strict, very severe lockdown measures. All right, so the data that we use, and this is where the trick comes in, is because we need daily data, high frequency data, which is not really available. So we are making use of real-time data that we actually extract from big data sources. If we look at the real-time data, then the main data that we will use is our index that we developed. Just for a little bit more background on the time period that we're working with, we're going to use to define if lockdown actually caused the loss in happiness. We make a use of the approach difference in difference, where we then have a counterfactual period, which is 2019, and compared to a period in 2020, exactly the same time period with 152 days in both time periods. Our treatment effect is then obviously lockdown, and we're comparing it to a time period which we assume was a normal time period for happiness. As I said, the data we're using is mostly real-time data that we harvest from big data. And then we also use other data sets available on a daily databases, like the Oxford Stringency data set, which came in very helpful. And then the main thing is then your COVID variables, which in this case, we use COVID deaths. Yes. So that's the data. Just some descriptives here, just comparing 2019 to 2020, what we will be doing with our difference in difference approach. So we can see that the gross national happiness decreased. This is average, it's means. We saw earlier that Philip Morrison showed the more precise effect for New Zealand. And yeah, it was interesting to see that the mean actually started adapting, or there was some adaptation. Then you can see we used job searches, that's Google Trends data that we weighted for 2019 and 2020. We looked at searches for alcohol to represent the regulations that, or the ban on alcohol. And then for the time period in 2020, we will use, well, I will discuss it, our OLS estimations of determinants. We use the Oxford Stringency Index, and then we use the total number of tweets as a control. If we look at the methodology, as I previously mentioned, we use the difference in difference approach. So comparing 2020, where we have treatment, the treatment variable as lockdown, compared to which we assume a normal time period of 2019. The gross national happiness is our index that we extract from Twitter and developed, which measures the daily happiness of South Africa. Our treatment variable is the lockdown variable. So 0 before announcement and 1 after announcement. We use announcement because instead of physically the lockdown period, which is 27 March, because we found the biggest variance on the day that it was actually announced. Once again, showing the anticipated effect of the lockdown. Here is a dummy variable as 1, and then we control for new deaths. Yes, all right, and we do various robustness tests, which you will see in the paper. Just to have some visual effect of the differences for the time period. So you will see we've got 2 time periods here. That is 2019, which we assume to be normal. And then we have a time period in 2020, where you can see this is the date of the announcement or the lockdown date, where you can see an anticipated already decrease in gross national happiness. And then as time goes along, we find some recovery or adaptation over time. But our main question is, did lockdown in itself decrease happiness? So what's the reason for the decrease in happiness due to the treatment effect, lockdown in itself? If we look at the results, then the main result here is to determine if our difference in difference effect here is then if you have your lockdown and interacted with year, and you can see there it's negative and significant. So in fact, the lockdown in itself caused a decrease in happiness. We also see that obviously 2020 happiness levels were lower than in 2019. Job searches in this case is not significant. Interesting, in South Africa, alcohol played an enormous role in as a determinant of happiness. People were really, really very unhappy due to the fact that alcohol was banned. The same for tobacco products. We add that into our robustness checks. Then lag deaths is interesting because we find it negative and it's on the square. So we find the inverted U shape. We initially, it seemed that people were sort of or satisfied with the fact that we had very, very low mortality rates. But as time went on, or what went by, people really became concerned about the mortality rate. Right, so that is on the difference in difference. So first question answered, definitely lockdown caused a decrease in happiness. The second question was, all right, so after the lockdown was introduced, what were the main contributors to this decrease in happiness? Now, I must mention our time period is relatively short. In this case, it's only 81 days. So we couldn't include too many covariates. What we did include are those mainly affected by regulations that were brought in. So definitely the alcohol, because we found with various tests that played a big role. People were very upset about the ban on alcohol and tobacco. Interesting that the number of tweets which increased over this time period was also negative and significant. Negative, interesting, we looked at various literature that found that if people move to social media, it very often contributes to lower levels of happiness. Then the stay-at-home index, this was quite a surprise. We tested and retested and retested it because in our initial studies, we found it was negatively related to happiness. But as time went along, the sign changed and we found a positive relationship. Once again, showing to, I believe, adaptation. And when we actually analyzed the tweets to see what people are saying, we found very interesting facts there. People prefer to work at home. They've got more time, less time spent on roads, more time for their families. In South Africa, crime decreased because people stayed at home. So it was a safer environment. So many factors that actually contributed, or initially where people experienced as a negative, is now seen as a positive. And what we also found is many people don't really want to go back to work and prefer working from home at this stage. Then we find the same effect on your COVID deaths. It's a lag COVID death, and we find this where it's squared, the inverted U shape, initially positive, and as time went by, definitely moving to a negative effect on happiness. So what does our results say? What do we find? Number one, the fact that South Africa went into this severe lockdown definitely caused a decrease in happiness. And we are considering the trends, I mean, the whole difference in difference approach, which we can say, yes, it did cause a decrease in happiness. If we then look at the factors that actually determines the decrease in happiness after lockdown, we find that your social factors definitely play a role. The fact that alcohol and tobacco, the number of tweets. What we also found is in the job market, which is very important, sorry, I didn't mention before, the concern of people losing their jobs plays a major, major role. Many small businesses has closed, and there's a lot of uncertainty about the future, what the future will hold. And we already see this downturn in the economy with consumption figures decreasing. So this is really a big, big concern in the South African economy at this stage. And then interesting is this squared relationship we find on COVID-19 deaths, which at this stage is definitely a negative effect on happiness. The interesting fact is that the stay-at-home orders are positively related to happiness. So we found a turnaround over time that people now see it as a positive, where previously they saw it as a negative. Now, from policy point of view, what can we do? Now, basically in South Africa, the concerns is if your main idea is to increase happiness, you must address those factors that influence happiness negatively. So one thing is give people back some freedom, which has happened with the levels of restrictions being relieved somewhat, so people can go outside of their houses and exercise. At level 3, they were still not allowed to buy tobacco or alcohol, still making them very, very unhappy. Then there's a lot of inconsistencies in regulations which cause uncertainty, which the uncertainty must be addressed, also inconsistencies. Then on the economic side, major interventions should happen, and assuring people of some way being able to give them grants, support over this time, also looking at more job creation, giving them some kind of insurance about the future and what the future will hold for South Africa. And that is it. Time for questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any questions? Please raise your hand if you have a question or post it in the chat box.
Martijn, can you see questions? I'm trying to see my chat box and I don't see it here.
Yeah. No, there are no questions in the chat box yet. So this was merely a question to the attendees. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box or raise your hand in the. At least I can start with a question. So what interested me is especially what I like about your paper is the link also to policy. But also, at least back for me, the question, if you look at South Africa, are there different groups differently affected by the lockdown measures? And how can you take that in also in policy recommendations?
If we look at the type of data that we use, the data, if you look at the Gross National Happiness Index, because we are extracting it from tweets, the only demographics we can get on that data is geographically. We haven't analyzed it on different geographical levels, but looking at other survey data, we definitely find that your lower income groups had a worse effect, or definitely from an economic point of view, than your middle income or your higher income. Especially there's a big difference or separation between those people that are employed and earn salaries and those people that have their own businesses. People with their own business were severely affected by the lockdown, where people with salaries, earning salaries, were able to continue.
Okay, many thanks. There is a question by Daniela, and I will give her the floor.
Okay, can you hear me this time as well?
Yes, I hear you well.
Good, thank you. My question actually was covered by previous question, but I can ask something else. I am not confident about how you define happiness, but it seems from that score of 6.3 that it might be an answer to the well-being question, right?
Well, in this case, the happiness is calculated on a score from 0 to 10, with 5 being neutral. So
okay, but what was the question? Because that is my, do you ask people if they are happy?
It's not survey data at all. So there's no survey data involved in this. It's purely big data. So the Gross National Happiness Index is constructed from tweets on which we do sentiment analysis. And from the sentiment analysis, we use an algorithm.
Okay, then you answer. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much. No, it was only because I had the same question. Like you already got it, and then I was thinking that I would like to have more clear because I missed that detail. But thank you, you answered. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniela.
Yes, Stephanie, can you, sorry, Talita, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. I didn't hear Martijn. So I was just thinking about some other variables, and maybe it's in the robustness, I forget. You know, maybe you can include some of the quarterly variables, quarterly GDP, or look at lockdown in its different phases. So you said there's, you know, a level 3, and so presumably level 3 is not as impacted. So maybe you have a kind of 2 periods of differences. So I'm wondering if that's something you guys have considered or looked at. And yeah,
I assume it's Kelsey. It sounds like you.
yeah, I don't know if you can hear me well.
I can hear you, yes. What we will do is looking into the future and looking at more into a longer time period. We will definitely consider, as the economy is freeing up, what's happening to happiness. And we actually have seen an increase. A major thing will be, the problem is definitely your time period, the number of observations we have to look at, especially if you start splitting it up into more lockdown levels. And then obviously the restrictions on the number of covariates you can use in the regression, seeing so that's not over-specified. But as we get more observations, there's definitely more possibilities of analyses and looking at the different lockdown levels to see, did it have different effects on your gross national happiness?
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Kelsey. We have a question, and let me see whether there are no more hands raised, but there's a question in the chat box. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name, but Stephanie, he or she asked, you said the data geographical. Do you see any similarities and differences between the residents in, for instance, Cape Town and Johannesburg?
Well, I can say that we have not started to look at any geographical differences as yet. This is still a work in progress. So the next stage will be for us to do a difference in geographical location when we look at a specific country. So whether it is Cape Town versus Johannesburg or rural versus urban, that is yet to come.
Okay, thank you. I think that were all questions from the participants out there. Many thanks for your presentation, really interesting. And we move on to the next presentation. And again, if there are any suggestions or additional questions to the authors, you can leave it in the chat box or mail the authors.
Thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome. Okay, then we move on to the next presentation by Annie Tubadji. Hi, Annie. Hi, Annie, can you hear me? I think you have to unmute your microphone and put on your camera.
Okay, so now everything's done.
Okay, perfect.
The only thing that didn't work was the sharing that I tried to do.
Okay, so the sharing is, you can try the...
I think it will work now.
Yeah, okay. Perfect.
So, thank you very much for making me part of this session. It is a terrific session. I was really excited by the presentations that were before me, and also amazed by the match between all our contributions. This paper that I'm about to present is part of a research series that me and 2 colleagues of mine are doing together, especially on the case of COVID. These are Frederic from Swansea University and Don Weber, who left us and is now part of the University of Sheffield. I mean, left Swansea, he was here before. We keep working together. So far, we have 4 papers on the topic. 2 of them are looking on individual and regional level. The first one is based on regional data and is called the Cultural and Economic Inequality and the Great Leveler. The second paper is this one that I'll present here. It is looking at the policy differences across countries. So it is on macro level if you want. And then we have a third paper, which is on micro level with a special survey which was done during the lockdown period. And yet another paper which is focusing especially on the relationship between mental health and cultural policy and cultural interventions before and after the lockdown. So we explored it at different levels. All these papers are part of the CEPR series on COVID economics. And there is yet another paper which is coming soon related with the reopening and the devaluation of life, and actually the breach of the human right for the protection of the life of every individual, which is about to happen with the lockdown. Removal of the lockdown. This said, in this particular paper, we are focusing on macro level, and we're making 2 contributions, one on conceptual level and one on methodological level. On conceptual level, we really wanted to look back into the literature related to behavioral economics and behavior under uncertainty. Because we know, as it was mentioned here in the discussions, that people under uncertainty behave in a quite different manner and respond to the reality in quite different manner than in normal conditions. So we were thinking this has to be taken into consideration, and there are some concepts and theories which we can build on. And this is mainly related to narrative economics and culture-based development and some further literature on the relationship between macro conditions and the mental health and satisfaction and emotional response of people. The second part is methodological, as I said, and we faced, obviously, in trying to write all these papers, the challenges with data about this condition. You either have to do quasi-relevant analysis with data which is old, or you have to wait further, so you cannot do anything on the moment to respond to the most urgent question. As we want to make a really relevant, policy relevant research, we said that, okay, there should be some kind of a compromise between the quality of the data and the methods, and maybe some innovation that can allow the small data which is available out there to be meaningfully interpreted. And when I say small data, it's funny because we are also using big data as the colleagues before, but in the end of the day, when you try to extract meaningful outcomes out of it, you cannot escape from the fact that we're talking about events that are developing only within a very short time period. So to make meaningful analysis, you have to aggregate it in the end of the day into daily observations. Of course, you can, for the sake of the exercise, you can look further into the dynamics, and we do this. I'll show you one slide about it, and they're interesting findings, but really policy implication can come more from the aggregate data. And still, there are some interesting things that could be done. So we hope we give an interesting hint with it. Then, what we focus in specific is the differences and similarities in the policy response to the pandemic in 3 countries. And it is interesting because it was natural experiment which happened with all of us. In some countries like the UK and Italy, lockdown was introduced, and as we all know, in Sweden it wasn't. This said, there was also another difference between Italy and the UK, which was quite significant, quite debated, and it was the time difference. So Italy was very fast in introducing the lockdown, while UK delayed. So here you have a counterfactual, which is the country that did not at all introduce the policy, and then you have two places which had also some kind of a difference. And this gives, in the treatment effect, this gives a very good foundation for comparison and analysis of the behavior during uncertainty, so the real behavior, the real condition, and you have a basis for treatment effect analysis, and we exploit this. I'll show you the literature review now briefly, then I'll go further into describing the data, the estimation strategy that we did. I'll show you the results and the conclusions that we think can be drawn from these results. I'll comment then on further research that appeared after this paper and which is quite interesting and quite in agreement with our findings for other countries. But as we saw already from the presentation before, there are sort of similar attempts, and you'll see that they quite speak to each other. So what is the conceptual framework that we have in mind? We start from Schiller, and as you obviously know, this is a person who won the Nobel Prize, and he's quite keen on working on behavioral economics and finance. So this fact that he works from finance puts him in the condition of working always on macro level. And he had a very big insight recently to start working on what he calls narrative economics and explaining how narratives affect the behavior of people. This work also has been resonated in the work of, unfortunately, the late Alessina, who was talking about the creation of perceptions in the reality and how polarized the perceptions may exist. And we see this polarization also in the case of COVID. Some people believed in the existence of COVID, some people did not believe in the existence of COVID, and so on and so forth. And the spread of this narrative has viral behavior. Just like diseases spread from person to person. So now what we put on top of this explanation from Schiller is the culture-based development perspective, that the fact that this narrative spreads actually creates a milieu. And has a special function in the evolutionary behavior of people. In what sense? Well, this about the evolutionary behavior is also reflected partially in Schiller, but what we are saying here is more based on Hall and his work on mammal behavior per se. The reason why culture always matters in cases of uncertainty is that it is giving us a reference point of eventually what are the heuristics that will save us. And this is true for us, and as much as we're proud that we are social animals, it's actually true for all mammals. So why we all live in herds? It is because we give each other a signal of what is the best survival strategy. But then the survival strategy of other mammals will be very important. So as you see, the strategy of these three countries that we have out there seems to have been quite different. So then this is giving a mixed signal to the people as to what the survival strategy is. And it's interesting to see what is the effect then on their mental state. The other aspect of this literature links to the work of Hirschman and Rothschild, which is already showing that the change of the conditions outside and the comparison between groups affects very severely the mental state of people, pushes them into sort of aggressive behavior, to interpret it in more straightforward terms. This implies that there is something which is aggregate mental health, and this aggregate mental health is impacted by the policy about different groups. So this is the main setting in which we want to further reinterpret the spread of the narrative. And there is work on such kind of aggregate mental health measures, also done by Frederic and Virwig. So they used big five measures for mental health, but these big five measures are more about stable conditions, so we do not compare it with this. We're using something, and this brings me to the empirical part, which will go in the next slides. We want to have a measure which is reflecting the mental health within the real period of uncertainty, something that will reflect the behavior of the people in real time. So we want to know three things: how the behavior of people is affected by the policy, so by the signal about the strategy that we have for survival, how it is affected by the objective development, so the real number of deaths. And then is there a difference and sort of a spillover or mutual dependence between the policies in one country and a neighboring country? And of course, UK and Italy are not direct neighbors, but they're part of the European Union, so they're strongly affected in network, also as a mentality, as a matter of fact. So the data that we have looks like this. First of all, we use certain signifiers within Google Trends. So we don't want to create an aggregate measure which is difficult to interpret. We want to capture the tip flow effect. So according to a tip flow distribution, the most frequently used words, come first, and they have a strict distribution within the language. But then there is work which comes from sociolinguistics, which shows that the ranking of different words or the rank of particular work changes over time, reflecting the importance of the work of the word in the contemporary discourse. So, for instance, if we're more concerned with war, we will be talking more often about war, and this will increase the frequency of the word war during this period. And then when we're in peace times, obviously this will go down. So in this sense, the connotation of the word reflects the intensity with which it is affecting the condition in which the people are, which exactly is the causal direction between the mental health and the language is not clear also for linguists, but for sure there is an association between the two. So we use the word death itself as a signifier for the anxiety of death, assuming that the increased mention of the word death means an increased anxiety for this occurrence of this phenomenon, death. In order to make sure that we are capturing indeed the connotational side, the qualitative side of this word, and not just some kind of spurious increase of searches per se just because people are at home, we use also counterfactual word, which is suicide. So this has the exact opposite meaning, the desire to enter into a death condition. And then we use yet another word, which is neutral, such as chair. There is some research about the word chair, again in sociolinguistics, which is termed the IKEA effect. And it is showing that these kind of words, which are everyday words, are behaving differently from emotional state related words. So this is the first part, how we measure happiness. Then how we measure the lockdown. Well, there is a clear definition of it, since we will be making something related with time. We know the exact date on which the lockdown was introduced in Italy and in UK. What was interesting was that actually it came the other way around. We didn't consider it, but then we saw it in the data. In Sweden, there was a reaction to the 23rd of January and nothing before and after it. So just there was a huge peak in this particular time. And it turned out that this was the date in which the WHO made a statement about COVID. So this made us believe that the data is really a good mirror of the events, and especially the information events, which were happening in the reality. And then we have also some our data is on actually 8 minutes frequency, but making analysis on as much as big it is, it would not be that meaningful. So we aggregate everything, and then we introduce also weak dummies in order to be sure that we make some sense. And this again narrows down the number of observations, just like in the previous study, into a relatively low number. But even so, there are several interesting takes. The first thing is that between countries, if you see here the first 3 observations, this is the frequency of search for the word death in Sweden, in UK, and in Italy. So it seems that the frequency is quite different, and it reflects in our understanding, roughly speaking, the cultural difference in the response to one and the same threat, okay, as much as it might have other confounded factors. The interesting thing is, however, that then in UK and in Italy, the difference so these terms here are the difference between the search in UK and Sweden, and the difference between Italy and Sweden. So as you see, in the introduction of the UK lockdown, the response to this policy intervention seemed to generate a stronger, to be associated with a stronger difference than in Italy. And the same also for the introduction of lockdown in Italy. The response was stronger in UK than in Italy, which is strange. Put in different terms, this means that while Italy was on aggregate level more sensitive, or in general searches more for the word death, actually the response to the lockdown was stronger in UK. So this is kind of a nonlinearity, which is normally called hysteresis and cultural hysteresis. And we think that there is certain evidence here descriptive about such kind of behavior, which says that this will be quite a complicated and confounded analysis. And we are aware that there is much more to do in order to be sure of the effects, but we think that we're presenting a kind of an idea how this can be approached and extended afterwards in the analysis. So first, we have a look here between the comparison between the search for the word death and the word suicide. So as you see, there is 2 lines. So the lower line, this is Italy, and the upper line is UK. The frequency of searches from the beginning of the period till May, when our data finishes. And then the same logic, but for the word suicide, and again here Italy and then UK. The main take, as obvious from the from the graphs, is first of all that the search for death increased, while the search for suicide decreased in both countries, and the effect was stronger increase for search for death in UK, and stronger decrease for the search of suicide, again, in the UK, which shows this, first of all, the different strength in the different countries and this hysteresis behavior. As well as the main take is that indeed our measure seems to be reflecting the constructionist and deconstructionist idea that contradicting notions are taking the place of each other in the mental picture of people about reality and the world. So this said, what is our model? Again, speaking to the previous study, we have the measure for mental state, which in our case is the frequency of the word death, which is approximating the anxiety from death. And we explain this with the moment in which the lockdown was introduced and the number of course, in an interaction with the time. And then the death dummy, which is capturing the objective impact. So the first part is the policy effect. The second part is the objective factor. If you want, you can see it also like the lockdown is the factor which is related to subjective response to the policy interventions and the signals for strategy, and the dummy, the death number is the objective factor which is really happening out there. Then we have a confounding element. This confounding element can be much extracted, but what we are doing is that we are using the lockdown date and interaction with the time and the death number in the other countries. So when we are making this estimation for UK, first we are interested, okay, how the lockdown on the time of introduction of the start of lockdown in UK and the deaths in UK affect the anxiety. But then we have a second specification where we would consider also the effect from the lockdown in Italy and the deaths in Italy and how this affected the perceptions of people in UK. And we think this is relevant because we were closely monitoring each other as countries, and there was a lot of debate about which country is doing the right thing. And we think this might have very legibly and trustworthy be considered a factor for the mental health of people in this period. And we want to see whether the data will agree with us in our assumption. Then, of course, this can be further extended. It was very interesting.
Annie, you have a few minutes to round off.
Okay. So yeah. I'm very far from wrapping up. What we do is 4 things. We make first a difference in difference analysis where we use just the frequency for the country. Then we make interrupted time series analysis, which is just making absolutely the same specifications but using a different estimator. Then we use Sweden as a counterfactual, and we take the difference between Italy and Sweden and UK and Sweden, and then we see how actually the countries with lockdown behaved in comparison to a country without a lockdown. And then we have the robustness checks with the suicide word and the word share. So I'll be skipping stuff just in order to give you a flavor of everything that we did. If you have a look at the first part, where this is having just the death searches for the countries, it seems that the deaths themselves didn't really have much effect in UK, but they were very much influential for the mental health of people in Italy. And we think that this comes to terms with 2 things. Either there has been a question of the deaths being really more, or this might have been actually the question of salience, because the Italians were talking so much more aggressively about this problem. The other thing which is interesting is the difference in the interaction effect. So when you have both the interaction from the local lockdown and the effect from the lockdown from the other country, it seems that the lockdown in UK decreased the anxiety of people in UK, while the lockdown in Italy had actually increased it. And we think that this is an evidence for sort of negative spillover of disagreement between the strategies in two places. When there is disagreement, this increases the anxiety, and when there is finally concordance between the two policies, this calms everybody. And I think this can be seen better here. So this is a discontinuity analysis. The first thing on the left would be, well, it's going towards. The thing on the left is the lockdown in Italy, and then the lockdown in UK. When the lockdown in Italy was introduced, this is associated with a jump in the anxiety in both places. When the lockdown in UK was introduced, there is a decrease of the anxiety in both places. It might be associated with adaptation over time, but in the same time, if you use them as confounding explanatory factors, they have a strong and statistically a significant explanatory factor across space. Then we repeat this with interrupted time series, and the takes are more or less the same. Here we have the predicted values. The difference between Sweden and UK and Sweden and Italy is a different way to approach difference in differences analysis. And again, the results are identical. And the final flavor is this here is showing part of the sort of robustness check. This is the word chair. So as you see, chair has absolutely no jump on the days of the lockdown. This is for Italy, this is for UK. In Sweden, there is absolutely nothing happening as well. If we, however, look at the hourly behavior, and this is something that we did to exploit further the data and what it has inside. So we see that this is the baseline. This is before the lockdown, and this is after the lockdown. So it seems that if you look on the intensity during the day, somehow before lockdown and normal periods, people were more stressed during the night. So the peaks are at 2 o'clock and at around 8 o'clock. While after the lockdown, the anxiety sort of distributed throughout the whole day, which is perhaps having interesting implications for the mental health of people, because it is a prolonged stress which they seem to be experiencing during the whole day. So the main takes of our analysis are, first of all, that while public policy seems to create a narrative which is signaling strategy for coping and managing, which affects people. Second, this has spillover effects. So what you're making as policy is affecting not only you, but also others, other countries. This shows that there is a sort of a Tobler's first law of geography also in the psychological dimension, that people seem to be related. And then the question of proximity will be interesting to further elaborate this study. Then there is work by Stephanie Armbruster from Basel University, who works with Bruno Frey. And then there is work about the Netherlands, which is quite, both are parts of the CPR, and they're quite close in findings for these two countries. And then we heard this about South Africa, which I really enjoyed. So it seems that there is an aggregate mental health, which is affected by aggregate public policy, and we have to consider this in more depth. So thank you for the attention. And sorry that I'm so talkative.
No problem. Many thanks for your presentation, Annie. Are there any questions? I see a hand raised by Kelsey. Kelsey, floor is yours.
Actually, sorry, that was a holdover from the last
Okay.
the last time. I have a question for Annie, but I'm going to send her an email. So thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? The chat. Anyone? From Daniela. Daniela, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I can try something, and this is generally, I am in Sweden and I speak Swedish, and I am thinking only about this setting with words, because what I see in Twitters is a setting of technical tweets, which are related to papers and reports and the authority. And the mix of language is both Swedish and English. And my general question for all these people who are using words in countries which are talking another language than English, I am thinking how they are approaching this. And another spontaneous reaction related to Swedish is that the word that might be seen as substantive from different perspective. I'm thinking about these details because it is like this data is taking in consideration and might give different kind of feedback, and especially, I'm keeping simple. That was the idea because we didn't have any discussion. I want to put something for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Yes, of course we consider this question. It's always a relevant question when you use Google Trends. You have to use the language of the country of origin, and we did use Swedish, and then we translated it the same. We used the Italian, and then we translated. And Google allows this kind of searches for a group of countries at least. So this was done. Then, of course, it can be associated also with some other reasons, such as, for instance, they might search for death because of searching for, many people died, okay? And they're searching for death for this kind of reasons, like making the funerals or something. So this might be.
I think that I was not very clear about what was my concern. It is the fact that if we want to know about the Swedish people mental health, and given that they are using both Swedish and English, I consider that if the selection is that people are looking only for Swedish and take away the English action on Twitter, it might mislead the picture about mental health. And there are other issues, but only keep this one.
Mm. Yeah, well, this is always very easy to check because you can do it both with the English check, with English search and with the Swedish search. And then if they're consistent or if they add to each other and so on, so forth, you can notice this even from the descriptive analysis. But yes, I would agree. It would be relevant to use both, especially in countries which are more bilingual. Maybe also for South Africa, this would be the case, but then I don't know how they would search for the local languages and so on and so forth. So
one question, in this data, what you have for robustness analysis, might be possible to take away these official accounts like the public health authorities, World Health Organization, and so on, and see what the data will say without these accounts and comments to their statistics.
Yeah, the question is only that this is on daily basis, and then all other variables were never available on daily basis, right? Whatever kind of national statistics you'd be interested to, or they're more difficult to take. What would be interesting, like it was in the South African case, it was, and we did consider this to do, but we just don't show it here, is to have other words, other factors that might be also very easy identified factors, such as the alcohol. Okay, this was something which was very easy to do also here, and is relevant and easy to understand what it is. Because otherwise,
Okay,
either you
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, many thanks. Given time, it's also that we have to move on to the next presentation. Annie, many thanks for presenting and being with us here.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to hear the next one.
Yeah. So we move on to Samuel. And Samuel, can you hear me? Can you unmute and or start your video? Perfect.
Hi.
Hi. Okay, great. So so the floor is yours.
I hope it works now.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start. Thank you. These were some interesting presentations and quite different, I guess, to the work that I'm doing. So it'll be a different perspective, but maybe it's interesting to some people either way, even though it's quite different. It's more from a behavioral science perspective and more in individual data and also much smaller samples. But this is a preliminary analysis, but I think it's an interesting approach. So bear with me for a few minutes. Maybe you can take something away from it. It is quite a long title here about the utilization of Corona tracing apps, but the goal was to make clear what this is about and which constructs were included in the analysis. So it should be easier to follow then and go along. In general, these tracing apps that have been developed, discussed, and distributed in the population in the past few months, and probably will also be continued to be developed and will evolve over time. The goal is to support infection prevention in a way, to monitor and track infection chains of the virus, to support people, provide information in case of an infection, to assist people in the monitoring of their symptoms, and also to provide support during quarantine in some cases, for example, by providing information or getting people in contact with mental health services and so on. In general, we could say that these apps are used to increase the perceived safety of the population and also to contain infections, of course, and to some extent also increase self-efficacy of people, so to give them something to do, something they can personally follow through with that can also help to combat the infection. There are several different ways of functioning of these apps. This is a very simple construction, of course, of the functioning itself, just to give an idea of two different ways. One is the centralized way of data processing, where there is a server that stores individual health data or monitors the data, and once people are infected or report their infections, then this data will be stored in the server and other people will be informed that we're in contact. There are some discussions about data security in this case, because there is a central data storing space and also people need to log into the server or have to be connected to the server in order to be informed. The distributed data processing has quite a different approach where people share data in a different way. It also has its benefits, but also disadvantages, because the system does not always work or does not work on every system. So not every smartphone user can use this. app and can communicate this way. So there are still some things to discuss and to work on, but in general, I think we could agree maybe that there are some prerequisites for success or for successful implementation of such a tracing app. This is the perfect functioning, of course, of the system itself. This is mostly due to IT infrastructure, to the technical development and the possibilities, the capabilities of the systems themselves. This is not my area of expertise, and from the behavioral science perspective or psychological perspective, that's not much I can do in this area, but of course it's necessary. Similarly, the aspects of data security are ones that need to be discussed, and from a psychological perspective, we can look at the role that data security plays in using an app or deciding whether or not to use an app. Also aspects like personalization or customizability, these are usability aspects that are often important when talking about technology and the use of technology. But in this case, it's also strongly connected to the development itself. So once the system is set up, and for example, here in Germany, the app was officially launched, then it will take time until something new comes along and something will be updated, let's say. So it's not as easy for us to change. The last point here, the acceptance and utilization in the population, is something that we are more strongly focused on, because we can easier identify predictors and factors that influence acceptance and utilization, and perhaps motivate people to use the app. There are some studies, some simulation studies, that suggest that at least 60% of the population need to use the app for it to be successful, to have a clear effect on the containment of the illness or spread of the virus. So this is something that we can focus on. If we look at the use of the tracing apps, these are some current numbers. Of course, they're different depending on the data source and on the number of, or on the process of estimation. But here, as you can see, these are just some numbers. For example, 5% in Austria, up to 33% in Iceland, 21% in Germany. In general, we see that the current use of tracing apps is much lower than the estimated 60% or the much needed 60%. So there seems to be a necessity to increase the number of app users for it to have an effect. So one question that we could ask is, what are the modifiable predictors of app use? What does actually influence the uptake and the continued use of such a tracing app in the population? And this is what we essentially look at in our study. For this presentation today, it's just quite a limited one. I mentioned this already. It's a smaller sample. It's a shorter presentation, I guess. So it won't take as long. Here it's just more health-related aspects, namely health concerns. So satisfaction with one's health, reflection about one's health. In the literature, these health concerns are often connected also to a higher susceptibility to psychosocial stress, and can also be connected to adverse health outcomes, but they can also be connected to increased monitoring or self-testing in people. So these are some connections to the use of such a preventive measure already. Current stress and the subjective health status were also included here in this model, because they are also connected to health concerns and can be predictive of adverse health outcomes, but also positive ones, depending on the action that we look at. And utilization here we defined as the intentions to use a tracing app in the next 3 months, but also the current use of a tracing app. And then we also included sociodemographic data. This is just a short selection of age, gender, and ethnicity. Based on previous research, we included more variables in the data set, but this is these are the ones I chose for the analysis I'm presenting today. In the general framework, we had a quite simple one. We have the health concerns as such, and based on the literature and previous studies, we thought that we might find positive associations between health concerns and intentions to use such a tracing app or monitoring app, and also connections to current stress. And we thought that we'd find negative associations with self-rated health status, in that people with poor health have more health concerns, and vice versa, maybe people with more health concerns report a lower health status. Then for the connection between stress and health status and the intentions and use of tracing app, we presumed a negative association with health status again, because people with a very positive health status maybe do not see the necessity to use the app, whereas people with current stress may use this as some kind of coping, for example. But the findings here were unclear, because the associations with between current stress or psychosocial stress and preventive behaviors were not clear in this way in previous literature. So this is more of an exploratory analysis. The analysis itself is based on an online survey which was conducted here between May and July 2020. We are still working with the data. The one I'm presenting here has 536 participants, on average 37 years old, 44% male. The survey itself took about 30 minutes to complete, which is rather long because we included several different measures. I will get back to that in a minute at the end of the presentation. And as incentives, we used 50 vouchers that were distributed randomly across participants, valued at 15 euros each. Most of our participants stem from Germany, about 93%, but there were also some other countries present in the sample. Looking at the data here, current app use, so use of at least one tracing app that had the function as described, was reported by about 21.5% of our sample, which is quite close to the estimate for Germany. So the current app users in Germany with 21%. So this is a nice finding here. And then for the intentions, here's just the difference presented for current app users and the overall sample on the 7-fold response scale to use a tracing app in the next 3 months, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. We can see that the overall sample is rather hesitant, whereas the current app users have rather high values, as expected, probably, but it could also indicate continued use because they also seem to be quite satisfied with the app they were using, which they also stated in the survey. If we compare these groups, then the app users and the non-users here, we did not find a lot of significant differences. Most values were quite similar, except for health concerns, actually, where the app users had much larger health concerns than the non-users. This was significant. And this was also something that we imported into our model. So in the correlations between these variables in the first steps, we also found similar associations as we expected, at least for health concerns. So health concerns were connected to current stress levels, to self-rated health status. Here it is a positive association because it was operationalized as 1 with a good and 5 with poor. So higher values indicated a lower health status or poor health. And there was also a positive association between health concerns and intention, and also behavior, meaning current app use. The other 2 variables were not significantly associated with these aspects. Sociodemographic variables also didn't have a lot of significant associations here, age and gender, some for health status and stress, which is as expected. For example, that females reported lower stress levels and older people reported rather poor health, but also lower stress levels. In a path model where we connected all of the variables here and also included covariates into the model, we did find some significant associations, which are printed in bold here. Again, mostly the associations for health concerns, but neither stress nor self-rated health status. And this was just included in the regression model. I can present this in a second for the behavior as well. So the significant predictor here in the overall model was health concerns. The effect is rather small, as we can see. So there seems to be a lot of issues still to clarify, some other variables to consider, of course, some of which will be presented in the discussion. Maybe you have also other ideas that you can add then afterwards. But here we looked also at the association for current app use, in addition to the intention, and again, health concerns emerged as a significant predictor, again with a rather small effect, but still significant overall. So going to the discussion already here, intention and actual app use were connected to personal health concerns in the sample, although the effects were rather small. Interestingly, adverse effects of app use that are sometimes reported and that are documented in the literature, for example, increased stress or poor subjective health, which could be connected, for example, to expectations, or as mentioned before in the presentation before, some kind of health anxiety on an individual level, not measured by the number of searches. So different kind of measure here, but similar concept, I guess. they did not seem to be present. So this could also be a positive effect of app use, or this could mean there's one less barrier to app use here. Targeting these health concerns might be a viable preventive action to increase app use. So this could also be an area of preventive action. However, of course, there are shortcomings, some of which are presented here. The connection between health concerns and app use or intentions of app use were cross-sectionally investigated here, so the causality is not quite clear. So I'm not sure whether the health concerns, the increased health concerns, were caused by the app use or the reality of monitoring, or whether the health concerns themselves led to the app as a good way of supporting this or of caring for one's health. And there are manifold other variables that could be important. For example, the issue of coping, as I mentioned before, with current stress levels could be interesting. We did not investigate coping as a variable here. Personality factors could play a role. Health consciousness could be important to see if this was connected with or considered a health conscious behavior, or if there was another motivation behind this. And also health behavior models are important here to see which other variables have an impact on the actual app use. And this is what I would like to close the presentation with, because these are the next steps in our analysis. We also have assessed other predictors or potential predictors of app use built on a model of health behaviors or health behavior change, which are here presented in blue, mainly variables surrounding risk perceptions, subjective norms, social norms, and also efficacy beliefs. I've mentioned self-efficacy already. And then there are the technology factors, so to speak. So technology acceptance, for example, perceived ease of use, usefulness, technology affinity, and also some privacy concerns or data security aspects. So perceived security and the importance of privacy, for example, within this infection measure. These were also other scales that are included, in some aspects regarding social and societal context factors. So perceptions of social and societal issues that we included in the questionnaire or in the survey, but we didn't have the time to analyze them yet. Okay, so I guess that's it. Thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to discuss any questions or take any further implications.
Thank you, Samuel, for your presentation. Are there any questions from the attendees? Please raise your hand or put your question in the chat box. Anyone? Yeah, Kelsey.
Yes, hello, Samuel. That's really interesting. One of the things I'm interested to know more about is whether or not you have variables related to personality or maybe political preferences. I'm thinking it may be the case that people who have, let's say, maybe more altruistic motivations, might be interested in taking up the app. That's one aspect. Another aspect is whether or not you have scope to do a panel dimension to this. For those who took up the app after they had the intention to do so, do you expect their anxiety level to decrease, increase, or maybe they have different reasons for taking up the app, and so that would also be quite interesting. So maybe a little more about what you have and what you're going to do next. Thanks.
Thank you for this question, or these suggestions rather, which are actually great. I'd love to do a panel analysis, of course. I'd love to have the funds to do a panel, which I don't at the moment. So it's difficult, but I think it's an important next step to look at this in longitudinal associations. Regarding the aspects you mentioned, we did assess personality by looking at the big 5 personality aspects. I did not have the time to further analyze the data set in this aspect. And for political preferences, in a way, we did not assess political preferences per se, but we assessed similar aspects in psychological models, for example, something like outcome expectancies, where we ask people about their expectancies of the expected effects of using the app. And one of these effects could be to protect others from getting infected or to protect themselves and so on. So there are different aspects like this that are assessed, and we also ask them to rate how important it is to them that they use this to protect others or to protect themselves or to do something good and so on. So there are some things connected to motives there or motivations there as well. And there were also some open-ended questions where people could state why they used or did not use or were hesitant to use the app. So these open-ended questions also need to be coded. So there's some data still to go through.
Okay, yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Okay, then we also have a question from Annie in the chat box. So Annie asked to you, Samuel, what are the technical limitations to ask people about behavioral elements such as alcohol take, even reasons for their health concerns? And then between brackets, sort of an open question within the app.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. So the technical limitations to ask people within the app. What's the question, I guess?
Yeah. Let's see whether Annie is still there. Maybe Annie, maybe you can rephrase your question.
I was just thinking that these are two relevant questions which are very easy to ask. So why wouldn't you ask them? Just extend the app with these kind of questions as well.
Oh, okay. So to extend the app, actually, what we did was we did not develop the app in a way, so we're not able to provide additional content to the app as is. And when we started the survey, there were still several apps in development, some of which would be presented. It was not clear whether there was going to be an official app that would be launched all over Germany. So we did not want to further develop the app at the moment, but we looked at the features it already had. But going further, we also asked people what kind of features would be of interest, or what kind of features they would like in future additions, let's say, or updates. So I guess.
So who develops the app?
So there are different systems. So there are telecommunication firms that are working on, and some governmental institutions that work together on developing the app, and also some researchers from technical universities are involved. So there are several different groups that work together on different apps or different functions.
Public consultation group and stakeholders involved in this thing, or they just do whatever they do ad hoc and that's it?
Well, that's a good question. In some of these groups, there are stakeholders, and others they are not. In some, it's not quite transparent. So it was in Germany, it was a huge discussion, for example, because some people were quite transparent. There was open source, and people could contribute to the process and so on. But other groups did not share their data or did not share their process. So it is quite difficult. And I guess it depends on the app themselves. If we wanted to look at one specific app, then maybe we could include these specific features. But here it was more to get an overall idea, because we need a very large proportion of the population to use any of these apps, at least to get somewhere from the prevention or public health perspective.
And have you considered maybe making sort of a parallel online survey with questions which are similar to the app and extending with questions that are relevant to the research?
It could be in a future area. For now, I think we don't know enough to really say what's relevant and what's not relevant. But in the future, it's an interesting idea.
Thank you.
Okay. Many thanks. I see the hand of Daniela.
Thank you. A very short question. I know that you said that they were 30 minutes. there are a lot of minutes, but my simple question, do you have any willingness to pay questions in this survey, what you ask the respondents? Did you get my question?
Sorry, no, could you repeat the question?
If you have any willingness to pay question for them.
Oh, of course, yeah. Again, I mentioned the health behavior models, so the costs and benefits, so to speak, is also an important aspect. So we asked people if they would like to, or if they were willing to pay for the app, and if so, if they think it would cost a certain amount, and so we also assessed this aspect, or if they think it took too much of their time, or it was too expensive, and the whole process of updating and taking the phone with you all the time and everything.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Also,
thank you.
Yeah,
that is very important. I would really want to be in touch with you about this aspect. Thank you. Thank you for all presentation. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. I think that there are no further questions. Samuel, many thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, and to all attendees and other presenters, many thanks for being with us this morning, or at least the West European morning. It is, I think, now time for some lunch, at least for me, but for others maybe for breakfast or dinner or midnight snack. And then we see each other again, hopefully at 2 o'clock. At 2 o'clock, we have two sessions you can choose from. We have for the COVID and well-being session, a keynote speech by Francesco Saracino of Stadec Luxembourg. And there is the session on well-being in the world, which covers several papers on well-being worldwide. Have a look at the program and, well, we see each other later on.